Chapter 4. I can talk Indian, Sylvanus boasted. Want to hear me talk Indian, Miriam? Nebi, that means water. What do you want to talk Indian for, Venus? Snapped Miriam. 'Tis a horrid language. I don't think so. I can walk like an Indian too. See how Audiobook walks? He makes his toes go like this. Venus, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. Why? Audiobook says I'm a skenosis. I'm going to be a big brave when I grow up. You are not. You're going to be a captain like your father, and don't you forget it. Venus, what's got into you to be so friendly with the Indians? They're wicked. They're our enemies. Sylvanus was only 6 years old. Miriam's idea of loyalty were far too complicated to understand. To him, this march through the wilderness was an exciting excursion after a summer cooped up in the fort. The Indians let him do pretty much as he pleased, and he could see nothing frightening about them. No one was fussing him to wash his face or to learn his letters. He admired the tall, naked body of his Indian owner, sinewy and powerful, which looked far more like a captain's to him than the exhausted, plodding figure of his father. Of the whole wretched party, Sylvanus alone was thoroughly enjoying himself. Once, when they stopped to rest, the Indian boy, wearied of teasing Miriam, stripped a slender ash bow and fashioned a small-sized bow and some light arrows, and showed the child, over and over again, how to aim and snap the deer-hide bowstring. His hands over the small white ones were gentle. Susanna, watching them, burst into tears, and Miriam could not hide her indignation. "Can't you tell Venus not to?" she stormed to James. "He likes the Indians. He's forgotten already what they've done to us. 'Tis disloyal." "Venus is only a child," James rebuked her. "He has been lucky that the Indians have taken a fancy to him, instead of abusing him. An Indian friend isn't a bad thing to have, Miriam. Indians have a sense of loyalty, too." That philosophy was incomprehensible to Miriam. She could never feel anything but hatred for a redskin. She hated them more every day of this miserable journey. She hated their unfathomable black eyes, their expressionless language. She shrank away from the food they offered for fear her fingers might touch theirs. Most of all, she hated the boy, Makoa, with his arrogant swagger. She could not remember how many days they had been dragging along at this slow pace. The days blurred together like an endless nightmare. 6, perhaps, or 7. Sometimes the sun filtered through the trees or scorched her shoulders as they followed an open riverbank. Other days it rained fiercely, weighting down her hair and almost sealing her eyelids shut. Some days there had been almost no food at all, and she could have cried like the little girls with hunger cramps. When the Indians brought down a hawk or a woodchuck, the slim portions were carefully divided so that even the Indians never had anywhere near enough. 2 days ago, at a camping place, they had found supplies left from a previous camp, a skin bag of bear grease hung from a limb of a tree, and a bag of flour. That night they had feasted on pudding with bear grease sauce and broth seasoned with snake root. After that there had been nothing at all, until yesterday, when the Indians had decided to shoot old Scoggins. The very thought of that meal still made her retch, but she had eaten it, like all the others, because her hunger was beyond endurance. With Scoggins gone, the Indians had fashioned a kind of woven litter, in which James carried Susanna on his back, a sore burden for his waning strength. Even though Susanna looked so frail and wasted, a breath might have blown her away. That Susanna endured those days at all was incredible. Sometimes, when the whole party came to a halt, and Miriam saw her sister slump to the ground, she was filled with frantic impatience. "She holds us all up," she would despair. "James said they would not bother with us too much. Any minute they may get fed up with her and decide to kill us all. If we could just do something about Susanna, if we could go ahead and leave her to rest somewhere. Without her we could get where we're going, anywhere, just out of these woods, anywhere where there'd be some food." But then a glimpse of Susanna's white face would shame her. Susanna never made a sound or gave a word of complaint. Sometimes, Miriam thought, the thing that exasperated her most was Susanna's patience. She herself had so little. The baby captive, for example, had driven her almost to the end of her endurance. At first they had taken for granted that, being the only other woman, she would care for the baby and carry it. Captive wasn't heavy, but she was a constant burden. She cried on, piercingly, for the food that she could not have. The sips of gruel when they stopped to make a fire would quiet her for a few moments only. The crying rasped on Miriam's nerves until she could not bear it longer. Finally, Peter Labrie had lifted the baby from her arms and taken charge. Certainly he had a way with babies, and there was far less wailing from that time on. The moment she gave up captive, the Indian boy was back at his tricks. She could not decide which was the worst torment, the bitum-no-see-ums, as the Indians called the tiny black midges, or this unpredictable boy. Several times, surprisingly, he fell into step beside her, walking with the lithe grace of an animal, and attempted some conversation, which she scornfully rejected. Then he would fall behind her and devise some new trick for her discomfort. Though his irrepressible spirits occasionally provoked the older Indians to a snarl, he was obviously their favorite. Unless his pranks interfered with their progress, they took no notice of him or of Miriam's embarrassment. Her one defense was her pride, and a determination to do her best to spoil his pleasure. When a furry caterpillar dropped into her portion of gruel, or a small snake wriggled over her shoulder, she held her breath tight and did not even squeal. She wore her hair braided now, like a squaw's, hanging forward over her shoulders, where he was less able to pull it. When a branch whipped back at her with cruel intention, she bit her lips and marched scornfully ahead. It was a sort of game between them, a cruelly unfair game with all the odds on his side. But she was a white girl. This loathsome boy would not have the satisfaction of making her cry. The 7th day was nearly over when Miriam suddenly remembered something. It was her birthday, and for the first time in all her life no one had remembered or wished her happiness. What a silly thing, to want someone to wish her happiness when heaven only knew what horrors were in store for her. This was the day when she had hoped for another party, when she would have danced again in the blue dress, with Phineas Whitney. Now the thought of him, which she had pushed back to the edges of her mind all this week, flowed over her with a great, lonesome ache that was worse than hunger. Did he share even a little of this heartache? What had he felt that morning, when he learned that their few days together had been lost? Tears gathered in her eyes, and would surely have spilled over, except that just in time she caught the Indian boy's curious glance, and winked them back. The party ahead had come to a halt again on the shore of a small river, Otter Creek, Peter Laborie guessed. Miriam had learned to dread these brooks and rivers to be crossed. They meant slippery moss, and sharp rocks hidden under wet leaves, and soggy clothes that never really dried out in the forest damp. This creek looked really frightening. The water rushed swiftly, and just below them it broke into rapids with a roar that echoed against the rocky banks and drowned out their voices. The Indians were evidently familiar with the creek, and were deliberately choosing a crossing place. They pointed, indicating a path from rock to rock. "No step that way," the leader warned. "Big hole there, very deep." 2 of the Indians were sent ahead to point out the route they were to follow. Then James Johnson, with the litter that held Susanna, stepped in carefully and forced himself into the current. Besides being swift, the creek was deeper than anything they had waded before, and Miriam's heart sank as she saw the water creeping up above the man's waist and closing over her sister's shoulders. 3 Indians each swung a child to his shoulder. Polly, in terror as the cold water crept up her bare legs, caught her captor's black tuft of hair in both hands and clung desperately. Peter Laborie had to hold the baby captive up over his shoulders to keep her blanket dry. The leader motioned Miriam to follow. The sting of the icy water snatched away her breath. It took all her caution to keep a footing on the mossy stones, and the pull of the current terrified her. Actually, when it came to deep water, she was as much a coward as Polly. At home in Charlestown, some of the boys had learned to swim in the river, but for a girl, even for a tomboy, such a sport was forbidden. She must make sure that she did not fall. She had just reached the deep water and braced herself against the pull of the current, when a fearful thing happened. Laborie, just ahead of her, tottered, lost his footing, flung out one arm to save himself, and fell headlong into the creek, losing his grip on the precious bundle he carried. With a gasp of horror, Miriam watched the dirty scrap of blanket that held the baby captive whirling round and round like a leaf. Then, without thinking, she plunged forward and struck out wildly. Her fingers touched the blanket and clutched it tightly in a spinning whirlpool. But her flailing feet could not find bottom again. She had gone off the course, into the deep hole the Indians had warned against. The current was too powerful to fight. It pushed her faster and faster, and the roaring was all around her like thunder. Panic blocked out every thought, but somehow she kept her hold on the blanket. Suddenly her body hit against some object with a sickening jolt, and automatically her free arm grabbed hold. Gasping and choking, she clung fast, and when her eyes cleared, She saw that she was flattened against a submerged log caught against the rocks, its jagged tip jutting out of the rapids. Gasping for breath, Miriam struggled with her awkward bundle and managed to heave the baby up and to hold her propped against the log only a few inches above the rushing water. Gradually her breath came back. As her own panic quieted, she felt a needle of fear for the baby. She could not turn her head or free a hand to move the blankets, nor hear a sound in this roaring. But presently she felt a slight jerking against her arm. The baby was kicking feebly, and a choking wail came thinly through the thunder, close against her ear. Captive was alive. If only she could manage to hold her up out of the water till help came, but the awkward position was back-breaking, with the other arm straining to hold them both to the wet log. Its rough bark scraped her ribs unbearably. She could see the rest of the party on the bank and could watch their excited gestures, but she could not hear what they were trying to shout to her. She was only vaguely aware of what they were doing. She did not see the Indian searching his pack, or remember the length of new rope James Johnson had brought back from his trading. She could not see the Indians recrossing the creek above her, or the stone that hurtled across the rapids over her head with a slithering length of rope attached. After what seemed an endless length of time, however, she realized that something lay across the water, and as it gradually stretched taut, she realized that it was a rope, only an arm's length away, from bank to bank, almost within reach but too far away to be any good to her. She dared not let go of the log. She knew she had not the strength to turn her body, to cling to Captive, to let herself into that swirling water again. Then she saw the two Indians were coming out across the water, swinging easily and powerfully along the rope toward her, her own master, and the young boy. Makoa reached her first. Holding out his arms for the baby, he tried to wrest Captive from her grasp. Miriam clung closer to the sodden blanket in terror. She could not trust Makoa. Captive was safer with her, even here, than with that grinning savage. "Give!" he shouted in her ear. "Give Papoose! Makoa carry!" With the swirling water about them, his dark eyes were very close to her own. There was no grin there now. He met her look honestly, and suddenly, with a sob, she gave the baby into his hands. At the same moment the other Indian reached her, and his hard arm went around her waist. The instant her grip on the log let go, Miriam lost consciousness. When she opened her eyes, her first sensation was of blessed warmth. A roaring fire crackled within a foot of where she lay, sending a glow that penetrated the soggy rags that clung to her body. Then she felt warmth close to her face, and realized that James Johnson was holding the baby's wooden spoon against her lips. The first swallow of broth made a hot path deep inside. Raising her head, Miriam saw the others all around her, the silent Indians, the children, Susanna on her litter, and they were all watching her. "Are you all to rights, sister?" James asked. "We owe you much, more than we can say." "I'm to rights," Miriam answered, pulling herself up. "The baby, is Captive safe?" For answer, Susanna pulled aside the wooden jacket that had taken the place of the gray blanket. Captive's wrinkled, red little face puckered up even more tightly at the disturbance, and her pitiful mouth opened in a hungry howl. Susanna raised her eyes and met Miriam's in a long, grave look. "She knows," Miriam thought with wonder. "She knows the dreadful things I've been thinking about her, and she knows that I will never think them again." Suddenly she was closer to her sister than ever before in their lives, and the love and courage shining from Susanna's eyes warmed her more deeply than the fire or the broth. Somehow, without a single word, their whole relationship was changed. Miriam had always been the little sister, always tagging along, always just a little at odds with the rest. Now she was a Willard too. For just one moment at least, Susanna's courage had been hers. She had measured up. All at once, for the first time since that fearful morning in Charlestown, something like happiness bubbled up in her. Here, she and Susanna both lay by the fire, soaked through and scarcely able to sit up. But Miriam felt that they stood side by side, and that whatever lay ahead, the two Willard women would see it through together. One of the Indians had shot and cooked a big bird of some kind, and now the steaming morsels were carefully divided. As her own master offered her a portion on a piece of bark, Miriam saw to her amazement that it was a piece of breast meat, the choicest bit. He offered it gravely, as though it were some sort of honor. The meat was stringy and undercooked, but as she ate it slowly, making each bite last as long as possible, Miriam tried to sort out the bewildering ideas that had crowded upon her in the last few moments. What strange creatures these Indians were! Were those howling savages who had burst in upon them at number 4 the same men who had built a fire to dry their prisoners' clothes? Were those greedy barbarians, scrabbling for everything they could lay hands on, the same men who here, in the forest, scrupulously divided the meager food into equal portions and offered it to the prisoners before they had tasted it themselves? They were sly, ignorant animals, yet they had a sort of dignity about them. "They have treated us well," Miriam had to admit to herself. "Nothing like those stories of what they do to prisoners. Yet I know they despise us, every one of us. If they don't abuse us, there is some reason in their minds. Or perhaps they are too proud to bother with us. I can never understand them." The real surprise, however, was still to come. After they had eaten, as the Indians prepared to march again, Makoa came toward her. She saw him coming, but she would not look at him, and, turning her head away, she pretended to be absorbed in braiding her damp hair. She was aware that he stood waiting for a long time, but she would not look up. What if he had saved the baby? A baby meant only money to him. The Indians would not let any part of their prize slip through their fingers. She still hated him, and his devilish grin. Finally, however, her curiosity was too much for her, and she raised her head to look at him. He was holding something in his hands, something bright blue, and her heart leaped in unbelief. It was the blue dress. "White girl wear," he said. "Old cloth no good any more. White girl put this on." Miriam sat up and clutched the blue folds tight, as though they might be snatched away in one of his tricks. It would be like him. But he simply stood, waiting for some word from her. Miriam turned her head away again. The dress was hers, he had stolen it, and he had no right to be thanked for it now. She wouldn't put it on, either. She would carry it every step of the way. Then, looking down, she saw that the boy was right. The old dress was no good. The rocks and the jagged log had torn the rotting fabric to shreds. She had no choice but to tramp through the forest in the only pretty dress she had ever owned. As the soft folds went over her head, Miriam felt her control suddenly cracking. She began to laugh, a laughter that sounded shocking and that she couldn't stop. "Miriam, what is it?" James was instantly at her side. "Are you ill?" "I got a birthday present," she sobbed. "Did you know it was my birthday? My only present. And it had to come from a horrid Indian, and 'tis too late to do me any good." She hated Makoa more than ever, yet somehow she had a definite conviction that he would trouble her no further. It was only later, lying beside the fire, that it occurred to her to wonder, uncomfortably, if in the battle between her and the Indian boy, it was she who had come out the winner after all. The Indians let him do pretty much as he pleased, and he could see nothing frightening about them. No one was fussing him to wash his face or to learn his letters. He admired the tall, naked body of his Indian owner, sinewy and powerful, which looked far more like a captain's to him than the exhausted, plodding figure of his father. Of the whole wretched party, Sylvanus alone was thoroughly enjoying himself. Once, when they stopped to rest, the Indian boy, wearied of teasing Miriam, stripped a slender ash bow and fashioned a small-sized bow and some light arrows, and showed the child, over and over again, how to aim and snap the deer-hide bowstring. His hands over the small white ones were gentle. Susanna, watching them, burst into tears, and Miriam could not hide her indignation. "Can't you tell Venus not to?" she stormed to James. "He likes the Indians. He's forgotten already what they've done to us. 'Tis disloyal." "Venus is only a child," James rebuked her. "He has been lucky that the Indians have taken a fancy to him, instead of abusing him. An Indian friend isn't a bad thing to have, Miriam. Indians have a sense of loyalty, too." That philosophy was incomprehensible to Miriam. She could never feel anything but hatred for a redskin. She hated them more every day of this miserable journey. She hated their unfathomable black eyes, their expressionless language. She shrank away from the food they offered for fear her fingers might touch theirs. Most of all, his toes go like this. "Venus, you ought to be ashamed of yourself." "Why?" "Atuk says I'm a skenosis. I'm going to be a big brave when I grow up." "You are not. You're going to be a captain like your father, and don't you forget it." Venus, what's got into you to be so friendly with the Indians? They're wicked. They're our enemies. Sylvanus was only 6 years old. Miriam's idea of loyalty were far too complicated to understand. To him, this march through the wilderness was an exciting excursion after a summer cooped up in the fort. Chapter 4. I can talk Indian, Sylvanus boasted. Want to hear me talk Indian, Miriam? Nebi, that means water. What do you want to talk Indian for, Venus? Snapped Miriam. 'Tis a horrid language. I don't think so. I can walk like an Indian too. See how Atuk walks.